From time to time, we all ask deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with trouble? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as imponderable as these questions may seem, many people have confident answers to these questions. For example, religion. Morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Enemies and demons. Problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed, punished, and defeated. Nationalism. Our tribe must claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Reaction. In the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe, but it is harder to put your finger on what you do believe. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I argue that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the 18th century Enlightenment. In a nutshell, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Now, many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they've faded into the background as a kind of bland default or status quo or establishment. The other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals, too, need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I have tried to do in Enlightenment Now. The Enlightenment, I suggest, centers on four themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion. Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you explain why you're right or why other people should believe you, as soon as you claim that you are not full of crap and you're not lying, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. As a species, we are liable to generalize from anecdotes, to reason from stereotypes. We all seek evidence that confirms our beliefs while blowing off evidence that disconfirms them, and we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible and that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. A key Enlightenment idea was that there can be a science of human nature and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. The third ideal is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Well, enhance human flourishing, you might think, who could be against that? Well, in fact, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance a mystical dialectic or struggle or pursuit of a utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because humans are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. By default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our biological relatives, our close allies, our good friends, and cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through the forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, such as education, journalism, art, mobility, and even pure reason. As soon as I engage in discussion with you, I can't insist that only my interests count because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Reason itself pushes toward a symmetry of perspectives, of points of view, of interests, and hence for the same concern that we extend to our own interests, we apply to others. Finally, these lead us to the ideal of progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, if human nature doesn't change, you might ask, how could progress even be possible? And an answer from the Enlightenment is that it's possible through benign institutions, which allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to combat the forces that grind us down, primarily entropy, that magnify the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln called them, such as reason and sympathy, while marginalizing our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our thirst for dominance and vengeance. What do I mean by institutions? Some of the brainchildren of the Enlightenment that we continue to enjoy today include democracy, declarations of rights, markets, organizations for global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies, and a free press. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, I have found that if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I have found that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Well, as it happened, Pangloss is what we would today call a pessimist. A true optimist would believe there can be much better worlds than the one we find ourselves in today. But all of this is irrelevant because the question of whether progress has taken place is not a matter of having an optimistic temperament or wearing rose-colored glasses or seeing the glass as half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit, that is progress. Let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years of age. But then with the discovery of vaccination, later of sanitation, of antibiotics, and other advances in public health and medicine, life expectancy at birth has risen to 71 years across the globe today, and virtually no one guesses that it's that high. The escape from early death was highly uneven across the regions of the world. Europe and the Americas were the first to see lifespan significantly improve, but then in the 20th century, Asia shot up, and Africa now is seeing spectacular gains. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low life expectancy at birth was the death of children. In 1750, in Sweden, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden then brought that rate down by a factor of 100, and other parts of the world followed suit, including in the Americas, Canada, in Asia, South Korea, in Latin America, Chile, and in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, which has seen its rate of child mortality fall from 25% to less than 5% in just 40 years. Still too high, but the decrease is continuing. Mothers, too, were highly vulnerable through most of human history. About 1% of Swedish mothers died in childbirth 250 years ago. That was reduced by a factor of 250, and other parts of the world saw similar gains, such as the United States, Malaysia, and more recently, Ethiopia. Health. For most of human history, the biggest killer was infectious disease, which has largely been eliminated as a source of mortality in the developed world. In the developing world, infectious diseases still kill people in large numbers, but the 5 most lethal infectious diseases have all been dramatically reduced just in the last 15 or 20 years, including pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and could strike populations, causing devastation anywhere in the world through much of human history. For the first time, following the agricultural revolution in 18th century Britain and advances in agronomy such as crop rotation, later the invention of synthetic fertilizers, the mechanization of agriculture, and still later the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids in the Green Revolution. First, England was able to grow more than 2,500 calories per person per year, the amount necessary to feed an adult male. Here we see the United States and France, and more recently, countries in the developing world such as China and India have massively increased the number of calories they can grow. And there's a graph for the world as a whole. Now, all these extra calories would be a dubious form of progress if they were simply making fat people still fatter. But in fact, they have been applied to dramatically reduce the rate of undernourishment in the developing world. In 1970, 35% of people in the developing world were undernourished. That has been brought down to less than 15%. First in Latin America, then in Asia, and now it's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. The most extreme form of suffering associated with insufficient calories takes place during famines, which in the past could kill people by the millions or tens of millions. Today, famine has been eliminated from everywhere but war zones in the world. If today people are victims of famine, it's not because we don't know how to grow enough food, but it's because war keeps it from people. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth to speak of. We can see this in a graph that plots the gross world product from the year 1 to the present. And as you can see, for about 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. But then with the Industrial Revolution and the capture of energy, the spread of education, the development of financial institutions such as markets and financial organizations, and then more recently globalization, gross world product has increased by a factor of about 200 since the 18th century. The escape from universal poverty and squalor was highly uneven. The UK and the US were first to make what the economist Angus Deaton has called the Great Escape. But then in the 20th century, South Korea has replicated that trajectory, Chile, and China and India are showing exponential growth as well. Now, all of this extra wealth would again be a dubious form of progress if it was all going to the proverbial 1%. But in fact, this wealth has been decimating the rate of extreme poverty, defined as the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and one's family, or $1.90 per person per day. By that standard, 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. That has been brought down to 9%. And indeed, the rate of extreme poverty across the globe has fallen by 75% in just 30 years. Many economists call this the greatest accomplishment in human history, and virtually no one is aware of it. As a result of the decline in extreme poverty, and for that matter, the growth of the middle class, according to a report that came out last week, for the first time in history, a majority of the world's population is middle class. The international inequality that is between nations, has turned a corner after having necessarily increased when a small number of nations escaped from universal poverty, leaving the rest behind. Now that the rest of the world is catching up and poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer, the index of inequality between countries is now starting to decline. Now, of course, inequality within developed countries has increased, not decreased, but that doesn't mean that rich countries are indifferent to the plight of the needy within their own borders. For most of European history, countries devoted no more than 1.5% of their GDP to social spending, to redistributing wealth to children, to the poor, to the aged, to the sick. But in the 20th century, every developed country went on a binge of social spending, so that today the median among OECD countries is that 22% of gross domestic product is redistributed to the poor, the young, the sick, and the aged. As a result, poverty, when it's measured in terms of after-tax, after transfers income, that is net of government benefits, in the United States has fallen from a third of the population in 1960 to 7% today. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, can people afford to feed and clothe and house themselves, it's fallen from 30% to 3%. Peace. For most of history, the natural state of relations between major empires and states was war, and peace was merely a brief interlude between wars. We can see that in a graph that plots the percentage of years that the great powers were at war with each other from 1500 to the present. These are the major states, the 800-pound gorillas of the day. And what the graph shows is that a few hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war with each other. More recently, they have never been at war with each other. The last great power war pitted the United States against China in Korea 65 years ago. If we zoom in on the 20th century, then it is true that despite the fact that wars were getting less frequent and shorter, the ones that did occur were more deadly, primarily World War I and World War II. But contrary to the confident predictions that many of us grew up with, that World War III was just a matter of time, and that it would pit the United States against the Soviet Union in a nuclear exchange, and thus would be even deadlier than the first two world wars. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union went out of existence peacefully, and World War III never happened. Indeed, if we zoom in now on the period after World War II, we see that there has been a bumpy but unmistakable downward trend. In the early 1950s, the rate of death from wars of all kinds, including civil wars and not so great power wars, was 22 per 100,000 per year. That has fallen to 1.2 per 100,000 per year. This is a gift of the rise of democracy, because democracies are less likely to fight each other, to global trade, because countries that trade with each other are less likely to go to war. You don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors. The rise of international organizations and norms that have made conquest an illegitimate way of settling disputes among nations, which was not the case through most of history, and sheer affluence, because wealthier countries are less likely to have civil wars. Freedom and rights. We all are concerned to terrified with the pushback against democracy in countries like Venezuela, Turkey, Russia, and the rise of authoritarian nationalism in Eastern Europe, and for that matter, the United States. But nonetheless, when you count up the number of democracies versus the number of autocracies worldwide, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. A majority of countries are democratic. A majority of the world's population lives in countries that are more democratic than autocratic. Lest this seem incredible, just remember that in the early 1970s, the world had only 31 democracies. half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain and ruled by totalitarian Marxist dictatorships. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. Greece was under the control of a military junta, as was most of Latin America and most of East Asia, countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, and Indonesia, all of them democratic today. Violent crime. In any region that exists in a state of anarchy, there will be high rates of violence due to feuding and raiding and cycles of revenge and vendetta. In medieval Europe, for example, the homicide rate was 35 per 100,000 per year. With the consolidation of kingdoms across the feudal patchwork, the rule of law supplanted the code of vendetta and cycles of blood feuding, and the homicide rate came down by a factor of 35. Used to be 35 per 100,000 per year in most European countries. Today it is 1 per 100,000 per year. This process is repeated whenever a frontier region is brought under the rule of law, and the court system and the police replace a culture of honor as a way of solving conflicts. It happened in colonial New England, it happened in the American Wild West, and it happened in Mexico, which still today has a very high homicide rate, but a century ago it was more than twice as high. If we zoom in on the last 50 years, we see that the United States, after undergoing a reversal, a boom in crime in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, has now reduced its rate of homicide by more than half, and the world as a whole has reduced its homicide rate by about 30% in the last 20 years. Not just homicide has come down, but also violence against women, such as rates of domestic violence against wives and girlfriends, and rates of rape and sexual assault, down 75% since the FBI first started keeping records in the early 1970s. And children, too, have been increasingly safe against victimization. Despite a lot of the publicity about kids being bullied, the rate of victimization of children at school has come way down since records were first kept, as has the rate of physical abuse and sexual abuse by caregivers. Indeed, we become safer in just about every way, thanks to advances in safety technology within automobiles, such as airbags and seat belts, and the design of safer highways and better traffic law enforcement. You are 96% less likely to die in a car crash, 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to perish in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to your death, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die by fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. There is one exception to this trend of increased safety, and that is the category that safety engineers call accidental death by poison, solid, or liquid. And here you see the American opioid epidemic. At the same time, we are 95% less likely to be killed on the job. We're even less likely to die in a so-called act of God. A drought, flood, wildfire, storm, volcano, meteor strike, or earthquake, presumably not because God is any less angry at us, but because of improvements in the resilience of our infrastructure and in emergency response systems. In fact, what about the quintessential act of God? The projectile hurled by Zeus, the literal bolt from the blue. Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humankind is illiteracy, and even in early modern Europe, no more than 15% of the population could read and write. Europe achieved universal literacy by the 20th century, as did the United States, and now the rest of the world is catching up, such as Chile and Mexico. Here you have a graph for the world as a whole, which shows that today 80% of the world can read and write, 90% of the world under the age of 20. And in what I know is the most unbelievable, incredible, difficult to swallow example of progress that I have come across, we have been getting smarter. This is true. In a well-documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing all over the world by 3 points a decade for a century. presumably due to the expansion of public health, of the spread of education, and the trickle down of technical concepts and visual symbols from specialized domains like science and engineering into everyday life. Well, do any of these things that economists like to measure actually make our lives any better? And the answer is they do. For example, the typical work week in the United States and Europe in 1870 was more than 60 hours. Today it is fewer than 40 hours. And a typical American worker gets 3 weeks of paid vacation, which would have been inconceivable in the 19th century. And thanks to the penetration of running water and electricity, and the widespread adoption of washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, as we call them, labor-saving devices, the amount of time of our lives that we forfeit to housework, which people indicate is their least favorite way of spending their time, has declined from more than 60 hours a week to fewer than 15 hours a week. Thanks to a shorter work week and less of our lives wasted in housework, the amount of leisure time that we have had has increased, both for men and for women. Now, you are all thinking, why has the leisure time for women leveled off? The answer is, women today spend more time with their children. A single working mother today spends more time with her children than a married stay-at-home mom did in the 1950s. So forget Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. The amount of our paycheck that we have to hand over for food, clothing, and shelter has declined from 60% of our paycheck to less than a third of our paycheck. Well, does any of this make us any happier? Well, you'd certainly expect that it would. And indeed, if you plot life satisfaction against the log of income per capita GDP, there is quite a striking relationship. Again, this is a logarithmic scale, which means that an extra dollar adds to the happiness of a poor person much more than to a rich person. But the relationship holds across the scale. Each one of these points is a country. Each one of the arrows impaling a point is the population within a country. And what the graph shows is that people in richer countries are happier. Richer people within each country are happier, with the expectation that as the world gets richer, its people should get happier. The data that we have suggests that this is by and large true. In 86% of the countries for which the World Values Survey has data stretching over several decades, happiness has increased over time. Interestingly, the United States is not one of them. Has this come at the expense of the environment, all this progress? And the answer is it surely has, although that is starting to turn around, because as countries become more prosperous, they can afford to get their heat and electricity and transportation with less damage to the environment as the technology of pollution control improves, as people can afford to install pollution control devices as their societies become more affluent. And also, when countries become richer, their values change. They put a higher premium on protecting the environment, and they devote a greater percentage of their GDP to doing so. With provable results, according to the Environmental Performance Index, a kind of report card on the environment, 178 out of 180 countries have improved the state of the environment over the past decade. Just to give you an example of our own country, since 1970, when the Environmental Protection Agency came into existence, the population of the United States has increased by 40%. Our GDP has more than doubled, and we drive twice as many miles. At the same time, we emit 60% less air pollution in terms of the 5 major forms of pollution. As we consume less land to grow crops, and as abandoned farmland is retaken by forest, the rate of deforestation in the temperate world has gone to 0, and in fact is almost negative. The deforestation in the tropical world is well above 0, alarmingly, but it may have turned a corner and already been past its peak in terms of tropical deforestation. And the amount of the Earth's surface that is protected against economic exploitation has doubled from 8% to 15%. The amount of the area of the world's seas that's protected has also doubled from 6% to 12%. So I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of being optimistic. It's not a matter of seeing the glass as half full. It is a demonstrable fact of human history, perhaps the greatest fact of human history. How is this fact reflected in the news? Well, according to the results of an analysis using sentiment mapping, which tallies the proportion of positive to negative words in news stories, during all these decades in which our lives have gotten longer, safer, richer, more peaceful, and happier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose. And for that matter, the world's broadcasts have gotten glummer and glummer as well. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from the nature of human cognition. The human brain estimates risk and probability using a mental shortcut that Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman call the availability heuristic. Namely, the more readily something pops into mind, the higher it is in the results list of the brain's search engine, the more probable we think it is. So images, anecdotes, narratives that pop into mind make us think that that category of event is particularly prevalent. People think that more Americans are killed every year by tornadoes than by asthma attacks. Needless to say, something like 80 times the number of people die from asthma attacks, but tornadoes are much more photogenic. Now, if you combine the nature of cognition, combine that with the nature of news. News is about stuff that happens, not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, I am reporting live from a country that is at peace. Or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. As long as rates of violence have not fallen to zero, as long as violence has not vanished from the face of the earth, which it never will, there will always be enough incidents to fill the news, distorting our perception of how prevalent violence is. Also, news is about events, not changes. And bad things can happen very quickly. There can be an explosion, a terrorist attack, a rampage killing. But good things aren't built in a day, and they can creep up on us. The economist Max Roser has pointed out that the papers could have run the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. Also, studies of news coverage and of the behavior of editors have shown that that journalism has a bias toward the negative. Captured in a headline from the satirical newspaper The Onion, CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of cognition, driven by events and anecdotes, with the nature of news, you can see why the world is getting more dangerous and always has been. Another bias that is well documented in human psychology is the negativity bias, that bad is stronger than good. We dread losses more than we enjoy gains. We think about bad events more than good ones, explaining an observation from Franklin Pierce Adams that nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. There's also market forces in the prophecy market that pessimism sounds serious. Because of the negativity bias, there is a niche opened up for experts to remind you of bad things that you may have overlooked. As Morgan Housel put it, pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Well, let me conclude with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that undoubtedly have occurred to many of you. First, isn't it good to be pessimistic, you might ask, to speak truth to power, to rake the muck? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Granted, there is a danger of complacency if you're unaware of bad things that take place, but of course, no one is calling for failing to report danger and suffering and injustice wherever it occurs. But there is a complementary danger in thoughtless pessimism, in a pessimistic bias, which is, well, actually there are two dangers. One of them is fatalism. If all of our collective efforts at making the world a better place have all miserably failed, why bother? Why waste time and money on a hopeless cause? Why throw good money after bad? Why throw money down a rat hole? As Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. And for that matter, if you think that we're doomed, if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence will, the rational response is, well, may as well enjoy ourselves while we can. Let our great-grandchildren worry about it. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The other danger to indiscriminate pessimism is radicalism. If you are convinced that our institutions are all failing and are beyond all hopes for reform, the rational response is to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, under the expectation that anything is bound to be better that rises out of the rubble than what we have now, or to empower a demagogue who promises only I can fix it. Is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything becomes better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems which have to be solved in their turn. Also, the world can always be blindsided by nasty surprises which take place against a backdrop of continuous progress, and indeed I've mentioned a number of them, including the world wars, the 1960s crime boom, AIDS in Africa, and the American opioid epidemic. And we face severe global challenges that remain unsolved, foremost among them being climate change and the threat of nuclear war. I argue that we ought to treat these as unsolved but solvable problems rather than as apocalypses in waiting, and aggressively pursue solutions, such as in the case of climate change, decarbonizing the world's economies via a combination of policy, mainly carbon pricing, and technology, the development of low, zero, and eventually negative carbon technologies, including renewables, nuclear, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. We should deal with the threat of nuclear war by pursuing denuclearization via improvements in international stability and reduction of nuclear arms, culminating in the goal of global zero, the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons. An aspiration that is by no means a utopian or romantic dream of beatniks and eccentric professors, but it has been embraced by Cold War hawks such as Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, William Perry, and famously Ronald Reagan. Just some evidence that the hope for solving these problems are not utopian fantasies, they're not romantic dreams, is the fact that there's certain kinds of progress that has been made in dealing with both. If you look at how much CO2 the world has to emit to create $1 of GDP, that is an approximate unit of wealth, you see that the UK and the US have undergone a rise, but then a substantial fall in carbon intensity with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of massive amounts of coal to power the new industrial economy. CO2 emissions necessarily increased. But then as coal was replaced by oil, which was being replaced by gas, which in turn is being replaced by renewables, hydro, and nuclear, the amount of CO2 that needs to be emitted to generate a certain amount of wealth has fallen. Other countries have also gone through rises and then falls. China most dramatically. In fact, their rate of carbon emissions actually literally goes up through the top of the graph because during Mao's so-called Great Leap Forward, he forced peasants to operate backyard smelters where they had to melt down their doorknobs and woks and knives to produce useless steel, sending carbon emissions through the roof with zero economic output. Then Mao died, China came to its senses, and is now in a process of reducing their carbon footprint per economic unit of activity. And India and the world as a whole are now decreasing it as well. Now, I want to emphasize this does not mean that we are on a path to solving the climate crisis. Those curves have to go to zero, and there's no sign at present that they will do so. But it does show that economic growth and modern economies are not irrevocably tied to flaming carbon. And few people realize that the size of the world's nuclear arsenal has been reduced by 85% since its peak during the Cold War. In fact, 10% of American electricity comes from uranium that's been reprocessed from nuclear weapons, the ultimate beating of swords into plowshares. Final question, and this is one that is particularly acute to me, since I have written extensively about human nature. Does the Enlightenment go against human nature? Is humanism just too arid or tepid or flattened to get people's hearts pumping? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in miracles, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. For one thing, secular liberal democracies are the happiest and healthiest places on earth, and probably in the history of our species, and they are the top destination of people who vote with their feet. And I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, perhaps even spiritual. It's not just a myth. Myths are fictions, but this hero story is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a hero story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient creature with the power of reason and the urge to persist in its being. Because it requires nothing more than the conviction that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, freedom is better than coercion, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell to be notified about new videos. You can follow us on social media, and if you really love what we do, consider supporting us with a donation. Links to all that good stuff is in the description below.